want to talk about some updates in Niger, and this is we're going to do a little bit of an old piece of news, and then we're going to talk about a new piece of news that is very startling and could indicate that when it comes to the war and the fight against extremism in Niger, that not only Niger but France, the United States, and many other countries in West Africa have been fighting, like in Burkina Faso and Mali, that fight is going to take a very dark turn in the near future. But first, I wanted to talk about a startling update that we're actually getting courtesy of Victoria Nuland. If you're not familiar with Victoria Nuland, that probably means you haven't spent enough time in the Ukrainosphere listening to theories about how Euromaidan went down. But Victoria Nuland is a veteran of the American foreign policy establishment. They are somebody with a lot of experience under their belt, and they were sent to talk to the junta, the junta in Niger. And what's interesting is I think a lot of people online, just due to the reputation that Victoria Nuland has, we're like expecting her to go into Niger and say, your regime, we will overthrow, we will destroy. But American policy in West Africa has been very much steeped in cynicism. Anytime one of the military officials that we train ends up overthrowing the government, no matter how many PowerPoints we give them on democracy, right? Whenever that happens, it's only a matter of time. A ticking clock starts until eventually, very quietly, as the news around it dies down, that the American administration reoffers military support. With all of the posturing you see with the dictatorships in Mali and Burkina Faso about the United States and about the West, both of them still receive support from the United States, support for Burkina Faso that actually might be redoubled in their efforts to fight Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terror groups in the region. The American policy in West Africa, while it would prefer that the countries we're working with are democracies, viewing democracies as, more stable, which is, somewhat ironic given the circumstances, but more stable, usually less corrupt, easier to work with. Of course, there's some ideological alignment, but the American government has not shied away from saying, you know what, we got to work with whoever we got to work with to fight the terrorists. But so I think a lot of people don't understand that the American policy in West Africa is not just democracy promotion. I saw some people like just saying that is our key interest in West Africa. That's something we would like, but the main interest in West Africa is fighting these terror groups. It's fighting ISIS, it's fighting Al-Qaeda, and we seem to be willing to work with anybody to do that. And even though American policy is you don't support militaries that overthrow their governments, and that we have laws in the book stopping military aid to militaries that overthrow their governments, the Biden administration has been trying their best to find ways around that. So I think some people I'm sorry about that little rant, but I think some people expected Victoria Nuland to take a much firmer stance, because what Victoria Nuland basically did is she went to Niger, said very clear that they should, restore the democratically elected government, but there was no threat of force connected to that. As far as we know, that hasn't been made public yet. But what the junta responded with was very alarming. They responded, according to Victoria Nuland, by saying that if the United States or ECOWAS or any of these countries invade, or there is a military intervention in ECOWAS, Mohamed Bazoum, who was the democratically elected leader in Niger, depending on how ignorant you are as an American and how you want to pronounce it, they threatened to kill Mohamed Bazoum if there was an invasion. Just straight up murder him. Hello, Mohammed. Bam. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad when your defense strategy is basically a hostage crisis. And that's why I said earlier in this crisis that I think one of the likely scenarios is that there isn't an intervention, but some negotiated settlement that allows Mohamed Bazoum to flee the country, maybe create some government in exile, or more likely live the rest of his days in exile from Niger. I still think that is a quite likely possibility, but this is concerning. This is concerning because obviously the killing of your political opponents is a bad thing. Definitely if they are the democratically elected leadership of your country. The more violent the coup, the worse the coup. And it would only probably add to more instability and fear amongst the civilian population for critiquing the government. Now, I do want to put out there, though, because as much as I want to focus on the junta who's in power and seems to be descending the country into a much worse place, I don't want to whitewash Mohamed Bazoum too much, because I feel like there hasn't been enough attention to the mistakes that Mohamed Bazoum made in office. Whatever mistakes he made, what the junta did was bad. They shouldn't have overthrown the country and then installed a military dictatorship. That was bad. But I don't think there's enough attention given towards his failure. So I do quickly want to do a little diversion and talk about some complaints that have been made of his government. This is actually a report from the United States. This is from the Senate from 1 year ago, which was a year into his presidency. Significant human rights issues include credible reports of unlawful or arbitrary killings, including extrajudicial killings by or on behalf of the government, harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, arbitrary arrest or detention, serious restrictions on free expression in media, including unjustified attacks or prosecution of journalists, and the existence of criminal libel laws, and a lack of investigation and accountability for gender-based violence, including but not limited to domestic or intimidation of partner violence, child, early, and forced marriage. Now, not all of these issues, I think, contributed to the coup, but what I will say is that it's very hard to evolve a nation's democratic maturity and to get the people to trust in these institutions enough to be willing to defend them if the institutions are not protecting them, or the locals don't believe that the institutions are protecting them, or the people who are supposed to be representatives of those institutions, like law enforcement or government officials, are engaged in rampant corruption, extrajudicial killings, etc. It's going to be very difficult for you to inspire the population to engage in some democratic fervor to come defend your democracy if this is the type of stuff your government is engaged in. Of course, I think Mohamed Bazoum is not as bad as the junta, but I do think this was a contributing factor, which is also why I don't think military aid is the only solution to the instability in the Sahel. There's going to have to be a lot more development aid. And when you say development aid, I don't just mean pumping money into the country blindly, because it feels like a lot of aid is just pumping money into the country blindly to fill the pockets of NGO workers. And I don't mean that to slander NGOs. A lot of NGOs do good work, but that has been a consistent complaint amongst those who've been monitoring NGO activity in the country. But like real development in the country when it comes to them being able to produce products out of their own resources, having a more stable and productive job market, a growing job market. And until the issues of corruption, until the issues of police racketeering and democratic maturity, and many of the issues that not only Mohamed Bazoum's administration are going to deal with, but the junta is going to deal with as well, except for the democratic maturity thing, because I think they're not really signaling that they have much of an interest in democratic majority. I don't think this issue is gonna be solved in the long term. Moving on from this, I'm sorry I'm kind of jumping from issue to issue. There's just some things that have been on my mind recently that I wanted to talk about before we get into the main story that's been very concerning for me. More than a dozen soldiers in Niger were killed in an attack near Mali. Now, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in Niger, there is a lot of terrorist activity. Niger less so, Mali, Burkina Faso a lot more so, which I think is part of the reason why I don't think a military coup is going to work in containing the terror group, since it didn't work in Mali and Burkina Faso after multiple military coups. There were 17 soldiers, at least 17 soldiers, that were killed in an attack by armed groups near the border with Mali, according to the country's Ministry of Defense. According to a statement released late on Tuesday, a detachment of the Nigerian Armed Forces, FAN, moved between Boni and Torodi, and then there was a terrorist ambush shortly thereafter. It added that another 20 soldiers had been injured, with all of them evacuated to the capital of the country. And then they claimed that more than 100 assailants were neutralized during the retreat, the army said. Now, this is all coming from the military junta. And the military junta is facing, of course, since they're engaged in a military coup, a crisis of legitimacy. any country that, you know, any administration that would overthrow their country in those first few months, they want to, you know, increase their grip on the country, increase the hold on the country, stabilize their rule. And if they're facing humiliating military defeats or ambushes that are killing a lot of their soldiers, that is something that could undermine their legitimacy. So there's a motivation behind the junta for them to misattribute the exact numbers or not be 100% honest with the exact numbers and fudge them in order to make them look better. I'm not saying that that is 100% what happened. I don't know what happened, but we don't have any video. We don't have any photos. We don't have anything that could confirm the numbers that they are putting out there. And we also certainly don't have a lot of independent reporters on the ground in Niger right now. I don't know if you guys have been watching the coverage of the coup in Niger very much, or the fallout from the coup, but every single reporter I see on the ground that DW or Al Jazeera or any major network pulls from, they're always in Nigeria. They're never in Niger. It's always neighboring Nigeria. That's always how they're introduced. On the ground in neighboring Nigeria. And that could mean like the capital of Nigeria, like hundreds of miles away. So it's impossible to confirm this. So I just want to know that these numbers could be fudged, but they had to admit it, and they did admit that something happened. In the last decade, the border area where central Mali, northern Burkina Faso, and western Niger converge has become the center and the epicenter of violence by armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Sahel region. Anger at the bloodshed has fueled a military takeover in all three countries since 2020, with Niger being the latest to fall to a coup on July 26. I think this indicates that failures over dealing with the terrorists is what led to the coup. When we don't really know that for sure, there's a lot of rumors it was actually motivated by but like the head of the presidential guard, Tatiani, who is now the new head of this military junta, had his job threatened. And because his job was threatened, that's why I engaged in the coup. But that's all rumors. It's unconfirmed. Of course, we can't read into the exact motives. They've stated that it was to deal with the, you know, the terror threat and to deal with the rebel groups that the government was failing to deal with. But many of the people who participated in the coup have said that leading up to the coup that the situation was actually being dealt with. And in comparison to neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso, the situation in Niger is better. So the reason I bring that up is because the basis of their coup, at least the public basis of their coup, and maybe not the private basis, because we can't really read into that. The public basis of their coup is that they wanted to deal with these armed groups, that the country was too unstable, that the country had not properly done with these armed rebellions, had not dealt with these armed rebellions, dealt with these terror groups, and that they needed a strong hand from the military to take over to deal with these terror organizations. That was the main basis of their coup. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff as well. Anti-French sentiment is something that is talked about endlessly. How much of that is like legitimate, like a neo-colonial resentment, and how much of it is the failures of the local officials on the ground being brushed off and then using France as a scapegoat. The exact balance of that, I don't know, but anti-French sentiment is often mentioned. And of course, the economic conditions of people on the ground in Niger are not fantastic, with it being one of the poorest countries in Africa and one of the poorest countries in West Africa. So there was a lot of negative things going on in Niger that they say motivated their coup. But the problem is, even if those concerns were genuine, which I am not sold on, if this is the result, because this is not even the first attack we've seen on the military junta's forces by terrorists after the coup. This is actually, I think, the second reported attack since the coup. If attacks like this escalate and terror groups take advantage of the coup to try to expand their holdings in Niger, we could see violence spiral out of control. We could possibly see villages that have not been in the control of terror groups for a very long time return to the control of terror groups, all depending on how stable this new military junta keeps the country and how well they counter the terror group and the threat of these terror organizations, considering that we don't know how long it's going to be until the United States and other countries in the region recommit forces into the country to engage in anti-terror operations. Now, I'm saying we don't know how long, because we don't know if there's going to be a military intervention, removed, and then they're in the country, engaged in anti-terrorism operations again. We don't know if it's going to be quietly the United States kind of starts to offer assistance to the military junta. Not really much publicly, but behind closed doors, because publicly it might not look too bad. Who knows how long it's going to be? But in that time period, they're on their own and trying to deal with this threat unless they can get Wagner in very quickly. And if they can't deal with it and it gets worse, then that crisis of legitimacy could spiral out of control and the terrorists could take advantage of it. Not only to get a stranglehold in the country or to expand their reach, but also in just the amount of violence they can deploy. And if they can deploy more violence and the military can't deal with them, that means an escalation in deaths, an escalation in fighting, and more instability introduced into the economy, and just a terrible situation for anybody in Niger. Not to mention the fact, if there is an escalation in terrorist violence, which attacks like this seem to point towards that could also mean more military coups. And think about how that reinforces itself. And that might sound like Dylan, you're exaggerating. You're dooming out too hard. I don't think I am. If you look up Burkina Faso, there was 2 military coups within like a 1 to 2 year period. The idea that there could be one military coup and then that fails, so they just do another military coup and then another military coup, and it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. I don't think that's completely out of the realm of possibility. Which, of course, that much instability would not be fantastic at all for any anti-terrorist effort in the Sahel. Because again, more military coups, more instability, terrorists take advantage of it. So the sad irony of this situation is that an effort that was taken underway, at least according to the perpetrators of the coup, the main focus of the coup was to stop these terror groups, to stop these terrorist organizations, because Mohamed Bazoum apparently was not dealing with them well enough. But the result of the coup, due to the instability produced and the isolation that Niger has entered into, with many of its security partners either holding back and waiting to reintroduce support, or just pulling out support completely. Definitely when you talk to a lot of these aid organizations, the ending result could be actually a worse situation for Niger when it comes to these terror groups.